My name is Cora Sterling. For the first 28 years of my life, that name felt less like an identity and more like a footnote in someone else's story. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a grand, historic house south of Broad Street where the air was always thick with the scent of salt marsh and my mother's gardenias. Our family was Old Charleston, a lineage stitched into the city's fabric with threads of wealth, influence, and unwavering tradition. My father, Julian Sterling, was a renowned architect whose buildings were monuments to precision and control, much like his home life. My mother, Lillian, was the quintessential Southern hostess, a woman who could orchestrate a flawless dinner party for 20, but couldn't quite remember my favorite color. Then there was Adrian, my older brother. Adrian was the sun around which our small family galaxy revolved. He was brilliant, charismatic, and destined for the corner office at the prestigious law firm where our father's connections had paved his way. I was the quiet moon, visible only by reflected light, content to orbit in the background because it was the only space I was ever offered. My world was one of muted watercolors against the vibrant oil painting of Adrian's life. When he made the dean's list at Duke, the champagne flowed. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in graphic design from a state university I'd paid for myself, my father patted my shoulder and said, "Good for you, Cora. A nice hobby to have." My achievements were polite little curiosities, things to be noted with a brief smile before the conversation inevitably turned back to Adrian's latest triumph. I learned to make myself small, to fold my dreams into neat, unobtrusive squares that wouldn't take up too much room. I found a job with a small design firm, lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, and perfected the art of being self-sufficiently invisible. For years, they didn't know my address, not because I hid it, but because they never thought to ask. My life was a quiet, parallel existence, running alongside theirs but rarely intersecting unless they needed a designated driver for a holiday party or someone to water the plants while they summered in the mountains. 6 months ago, I packed up that quiet existence and moved it 250 miles down the coast to Savannah, Georgia. I didn't tell them. The silence that followed was absolute. No calls, no texts, not even a forwarded piece of junk mail. I had simply evaporated from their world, and they hadn't noticed the change in the atmosphere. It's been 6 months since I moved to Savannah, and the quiet here is different. It's not the hollow quiet of being overlooked. It's the rich, warm silence of chosen solitude. My new life is a tapestry woven with threads of my own choosing. I found a remote position as a lead UX/UI designer for Verdant Tech, a company that develops software for environmental sustainability. My work is meaningful, my colleagues respect me, and my salary has afforded me a freedom I once only dreamed of. I live in a small apartment in the historic district with a wrought iron balcony that overlooks a courtyard shaded by a sprawling live oak. The Spanish moss hangs like soft, gray lace, and in the evenings, the air smells of jasmine and damp earth. I've made friends here. Finn, a potter with clay permanently under his fingernails, and Zoe, a bookstore owner who reads tarot cards and makes the best biscuits I've ever tasted. They're my found family, the kind you build, not the kind you were born into. My grandmother, Nana Iris, calls me every Sunday. She's the only one from that other life who ever saw me clearly. She knows my address. She knows about my promotion. She knows that I've started saving for a down payment on a little fixer-upper cottage in the Victorian district. My parents and my brother know none of this. They don't know that I've learned to value the sound of my own thoughts, that I've started painting again, or that for the first time in my life, I feel truly at home. They didn't know and they didn't care. Until last week. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, the screen flashing a name I hadn't seen in almost a year, Julian Sterling. I let it ring 4 times, my heart a steady, calm drum against my ribs. The panic I would have once felt was gone, replaced by a quiet curiosity. I answered. His voice was clipped, devoid of warmth or preamble. "Cora, you need to be in Charleston next Saturday." It wasn't a question or a request. It was a summons. I leaned back in my desk chair, gazing out at the dappled sunlight filtering through the oak leaves. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this call had nothing to do with me and everything to do with them. "Why?" I asked, my voice even. There was a huff of impatience on the other end of the line. It's your brother's engagement dinner. He's marrying Isabel Davenport. Her family is particular. They want to meet everyone. Of course. The Davenports were practically Charleston royalty, their name synonymous with old money and unshakable social standing. This wasn't about family, it was about presentation. They needed a complete set of matching family china for display, and they'd just discovered a saucer was missing. I was the saucer. A small, sad smile touched my lips. The silence from their end had never been about my well-being. It was simply that my absence hadn't inconvenienced them until now. I'm sorry, Julian, I said, using his first name. It felt like slipping a key into a lock I hadn't realized I held. I won't be able to make it. The silence that followed was sharp, charged with disbelief. What do you mean, you won't be able to make it? This is for your brother. It's important. I have plans, I said simply. My plans consisted of visiting the farmer's market, working on a watercolor of Forsyth Park, and having dinner with Finn and Zoe. They were small, quiet plans, but they were mine. They were sacred. Cora, don't be difficult, he snapped, his tone shifting from command to irritation. The Davenports are a very prominent family. It will reflect poorly on all of us if Adrian's own sister doesn't show up to celebrate his engagement. There it was. Us. The collective, the performance, the carefully curated image of the perfect Sterling family. My role was not to be a sister, but to be a prop. I moved 6 months ago, I said, the words falling softly into the tense silence. I live in Savannah now. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint crackle of the phone line. I could almost picture him, standing in his study, surrounded by architectural models and leather-bound books, his face a mask of controlled fury. You what? You moved out of the state without telling your family. The irony was so thick I could taste it. You didn't know my address in Charleston, I reminded him gently. It was a 20-minute drive from your house. Why does it matter now that I'm a few hours away? He couldn't answer that, not honestly. So he deflected. That is not the point. The point is, you have a duty to your family. What is your address? I'll have a ticket booked for you. The request for my address, not out of care, but for the purpose of summoning me, was the final, clarifying piece. The point, I said, my voice steady and clear, is that you're not asking because you want to see me. You're asking because you need something from me. And the answer is no. I didn't wait for a response. I ended the call, my hand as steady as a surgeon's. The silence that rushed back in was my own. It was peaceful. It was powerful. My phone lit up again almost immediately. Missed call. Julian Sterling. Then a text. Then another. Then my mother's name appeared, then Adrian's. I watched them flash across the screen like distress signals from a ship I was no longer on. I turned my phone to silent, made a cup of herbal tea, and sat on my balcony, watching the evening light turn the Spanish moss to gold. The quiet was mine. I had earned it. The days that followed were a predictable storm of guilt and manipulation. The text messages evolved from demanding to pleading to outright accusatory. My mother, Lillian, called on Thursday. Her voice was laced with a strained, syrupy sweetness that she reserved for difficult social situations. Cora, darling, she began, as if we'd spoken just yesterday. Your father told me you're feeling a bit distant. We're all so worried about you. I'm not distant, Mother. I'm fine, I said, keeping my tone neutral. I was watering the small pot of basil on my kitchen windowsill. Its fresh, green sent a grounding presence. Well, this whole business about the dinner is just silly. It's for Adrian. He's your brother. He's counting on you to be there. We need to present a united front for the Davenports. A united front. The phrase hung in the air, a hollow military command for a family that had never been a cohesive unit. Unity is something you build every day, Mother. It's not something you can put on like a dress for a party. A frustrated sigh whispered through the phone. Don't be so dramatic, Cora. It's one evening. You come, you smile, you wear the nice dress I bought you for Christmas 2 years ago, do you even still have it, and then you can go back to whatever it is you're doing. Her casual dismissal of my life, her assumption that I was just waiting in the wings to be called upon, was the same old song in a different key. You mean I can disappear again, just as long as I'm visible when you need me to be? The line went quiet. I heard the sharp, indignant intake of her breath. That is a very cruel thing to say. Is it? I asked, my voice soft. Or is it just the truth? She hung up without another word. Adrian tried next. His approach was different, tinged with a genuine, almost boyish confusion that was harder to deflect. Cora? What's going on? Mom's a wreck and Dad is acting like someone scratched his car. Can't you just come? For me. For a moment, a flicker of the old dynamic, the old love for the brother he sometimes was, pricked at my heart. I remembered him teaching me to ride a bike, his hand steady on the back of the seat. But I also remembered the countless dinners where he'd let our parents' praise wash over him while I sat in silence. He was a kind person, but his kindness had always been passive. He never stood up for me, never questioned the imbalance. He benefited from it too much to see it as a problem. I can't, Adrian, I said, and the sadness in my voice was real. This is about more than just one dinner. I don't get it, he said, and I knew he was telling the truth. He didn't. He had never had to. I know, I said softly, and ended the call before he could ask any more questions I didn't have the energy to answer. The final salvo came from my father on Friday morning, the day before the dinner. The pretense of civility was gone. His voice was cold, hard steel. I've tried to be reasonable, Cora, he said. If you do not show up tomorrow night, you can consider yourself written out of my will. You will not see a single cent. I leaned my head back against the wall of my sun-drenched living room. The threat was meant to be a nuclear option, the final, terrifying blow that would bring me to my knees. A few years ago, it might have worked. The fear of being completely cast out, of losing that last, theoretical safety net, would have been paralyzing. But I had spent those years weaving my own net. It was made of late nights, freelance projects, careful budgets, and the quiet satisfaction of a growing savings account. It was made of my talent, my work ethic, and my unwavering belief in my own ability to survive. I let the silence stretch, just long enough for him to think his threat had landed, that I was weighing my options. Then I spoke, my voice calm and clear as a bell. Julian, I said, the inheritance you're holding over my head is a safety net I wove for myself years ago. You're threatening to take away something you never gave me. I could hear his sharp, shocked intake of breath, as if I'd struck him. You're bluffing. That little design job of yours. If you had ever once asked me about my life, I interrupted, my voice still quiet, still gentle, if you had shown an ounce of interest in the person I've become, you would know that I am not bluffing. I am the lead designer for a major tech firm. My portfolio is respected in my field. I am financially independent. I have been for a very long time. The silence on his end was absolute. It was the silence of a man whose power had just evaporated in his hand. He didn't have a response. He had run out of threats. He had no more moves to make. He hung up the phone. That was the last call I answered. I felt a profound sense of lightness, as if a great, heavy cloak I'd been wearing my whole life had finally slipped from my shoulders. I turned off my phone, opened my laptop, and navigated to a bookmarked real estate website. The little cottage in the Victorian district, the one with the wraparound porch and the overgrown garden, was still listed. I stared at the pictures for a long time, not as a dream, but as a plan. The next morning, my phone remained off. The sun streamed through my windows, and the world outside was humming with the lazy, vibrant energy of a Savannah Saturday. Instead of boarding a plane to Charleston, I put on my walking shoes and headed to Forsyth Park. The great fountain was spraying a fine mist into the air, and the sunlight filtering through the canopy of live oaks painted shifting patterns on the wide, paved paths. I bought a coffee from a cart and sat on a bench, watching the world go by. I felt no anger, no resentment, only a quiet, resolute peace. This was my life. I was choosing it, actively, with every breath. That afternoon, my phone rang with a call I would always take. I had turned it back on just for this. Nana Iris, I answered, a genuine smile in my voice. Hello, my darling, she said, her voice a familiar, comforting melody. Just checking in. How's the air in your corner of the world? It's warm and clear, I said. Peaceful. We chatted for a few minutes about her garden and a new book she was reading. Nana Iris never rushed. She built a bridge of pleasantries before walking across it to the real subject. They asked me to call you, she said, her tone matter of fact. Lillian was in a state this morning. Julian is silent, which is somehow worse. They wanted me to try and convince you. I figured as much, I sighed, tracing a pattern on my dusty windowsill. Let me guess. For the good of the family. Those were the words she used, yes, Nana Iris confirmed. But I told them I wouldn't. I told them you were a grown woman who was perfectly capable of making her own decisions, and that perhaps they should have thought about the good of the family on all the birthdays they forgot. A short, breathy laugh escaped me. Nana Iris was my truth-teller, the one person who had never tried to gaslight me into believing their version of reality. She was the one who sent me a check for my first month's rent after college, who called me after I got my first real job to tell me she was proud, who saw the art I made and called it talent, not a hobby. Thank you, Nana. There's nothing to thank me for, Cora. Love isn't about keeping up appearances. It's about showing up, even when no one's watching. They're panicking, Because they miss me? I asked, a sliver of the old, hopeful child peeking through. Nana Iris paused, and in that pause, she gave me the gift of the unvarnished truth. No, sweetheart. They're panicking because Isabel's family is watching. And they're asking questions. Of course. My absence wasn't a hole in their hearts, it was a flaw in their presentation. My value hadn't magically appeared, it had simply been illuminated by the spotlight of someone else's judgment. I'm not going, I said again, the words feeling more solid, more real than ever before. I know, darling, she said, her voice full of warmth. And I wouldn't either. You go enjoy your Saturday. You've earned it. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the evening sketching the facade of the little cottage from the real estate listing. I drew in the flower boxes I would install, the rocking chairs I'd put on the porch, the rambling wisteria I'd trained to climb the columns. I was not just designing a house, I was designing a life. The call came a week later. It was Nana Iris again. I was at my desk, refining a wireframe for a new app, the late afternoon sun slanting across my keyboard. Well, she began, without any preamble, the fallout has been interesting. I leaned back in my chair, waiting. The dinner was tense, she said. Your mother overcompensated, all frantic energy and bright, brittle smiles. Your father was practically mute. Adrian looked like he was walking to his own execution. But the real story is Isabel's mother, Margaret Davenport. What about her? She's sharp as a tack, that one. She doesn't miss a thing. She noticed the empty chair, of course. Lillian tried to wave it away, said you were terribly ill with the flu. But then Margaret asked why you weren't at the informal meet and greet last month either. And why she'd never heard Adrian mention a sister before. I closed my eyes, picturing the scene. The elegant dining room, the crystal glasses, the suffocating weight of all those unspoken things. The lies started to pile up, Nana continued. A work emergency, a last-minute trip abroad. It was a clumsy, patchwork quilt of excuses, and Margaret saw every stitch. I heard from a friend who was there that she pulled Lillian aside after most of the guests had left. No one knows what was said, but Lillian came back to the table looking like she'd seen a ghost. A strange sense of calm washed over me. It wasn't glee, not a shred of it. It was the quiet, profound satisfaction of watching a dam of carefully constructed falsehoods finally begin to crack under the pressure of one small, absent stone. And Adrian? I asked. Isabel has been asking him questions directly. Apparently, she's not the type to let things go. She wants to know why her future husband's family has a ghost. The perfect family portrait they tried to sell her is starting to look like a forgery. They still think this is just about me being stubborn, don't they? I murmured. For now, Nana Iris said, her voice gentle but firm. But what they're slowly starting to realize, Cora, is that this isn't about one dinner. It's about the foundation. Margaret Davenport didn't just see an empty chair. She saw the years of neglect that made the chair empty. She saw the imbalance. She saw the damage. And she doesn't like what she sees. We talked for a little while longer, and, before we hung up, she said, they asked me for your address again. They're talking about driving down to talk some sense into you. You didn't give it to them, did you? Of course not, she scoffed. I told them that sense, like respect, is something you earn, not something you can demand. That night, I didn't sleep right away. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the city, a distant siren, the murmur of voices from the street below. My family hadn't just ignored me, they had erased me. They had created a version of their lives where I was so peripheral, she could be written out of the script entirely. But now, someone else had opened that script and noticed a missing character. My absence, the very thing they had cultivated for years, had suddenly become their biggest liability. They were the ones who had made me disappear. They just hadn't counted on anyone else noticing I was gone. 2 weeks after the disastrous engagement dinner, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment. There was no return address, but I recognized my mother's elegant, looping script immediately. It had been forwarded from my old address, a small, tangible piece of a life I'd left behind. I held it in my hands for a long moment, feeling its weight. I could guess the contents: pages of carefully worded guilt, appeals to sentiment, accusations veiled in concern, a desperate attempt to rewrite history and pull me back into the narrative she'd written for us. It was a final, beautifully calligraphed plea for me to return to my designated place in the background. I walked out to the shared courtyard of my apartment building. A small, communal fire pit sat in the center, cold and unused. I crumpled a bit of newspaper, struck a match, and watched the small flame catch. Then, without a moment's hesitation, I dropped the unopened letter into the fire. I watched as the cream paper curled, turned black at the edges, and dissolved into a wisp of gray ash that drifted up into the humid evening air. I wasn't burning a bridge. I was acknowledging that there had never been a bridge there to begin with, only a tightrope I was no longer willing to walk. The next morning, I called the real estate agent and made an offer on the cottage in the Victorian district. My offer was accepted. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, inspections, and loan applications. Every document I signed felt like another brick being laid in the foundation of my new life. Cora Sterling, sole owner. The words on the deed were a quiet declaration of independence. I changed my phone number. I sent the new one to Nana Iris, to Finn and Zoe, and to my boss. That was the entire list. The silence that followed was no longer a question mark. It was a period. A definitive, peaceful end to a chapter one was ready to close. The house was a beautiful, chaotic mess. The floors needed refinishing, the walls begged for fresh paint, and the garden was a jungle of weeds and forgotten rose bushes. But it was mine. Finn helped me rip out the old, stained carpet, and Zoe brought over sandwiches and beer, her laughter echoing in the empty rooms. We spent a whole weekend just clearing the garden, discovering a hidden stone pathway beneath the tangle of weeds. We worked until our muscles ached and our hands were raw, and as the sun set, we sat on the porch steps, tired and triumphant. "You're really doing it, see," Finn said, wiping a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "Building a whole new world from scratch." "I'm not starting from scratch," I said, looking at the two of them, their faces glowing in the twilight. "I have a pretty great foundation." 6 months later, the cottage was transformed. The walls were a soft sage green, the floors gleamed, and the garden was a riot of color and life. I had planted lavender, rosemary, and 3 sprawling tomato plants that were already heavy with fruit. The wisteria was beginning to wind its way up the porch columns. I decided to throw a housewarming party. It wasn't a grand affair like my mother's, with caterers and printed invitations. I just sent out a group text to my small, beloved circle. The backyard was filled with laughter and the scent of grilled peaches and citronella. Finn was at the grill, Zoe was orchestrating a playlist of old soul music, and my new neighbors from next door had brought a bottle of wine and their goofy golden retriever, who was now asleep on my feet. A few of my colleagues from Verdant Tech had come, mingling easily with my friends. It was a motley crew, a patchwork family, and they filled the space with a warmth and authenticity my old house had never known. Later, as the fireflies began to blink in the twilight, a neighbor I'd only met a few times, a kind woman named Ms. Gable, sat down next to me on the porch swing. "This place is just beautiful, Cora," she said, her eyes sweeping over the glowing windows of the house and the happy chaos in the yard. "You've made it a real home. Do you have family back in Charleston?" I thought for a moment, the question no longer carrying the weight it once did. I looked across the yard, at Zoe trying to teach Finn how to dance, at my colleague laughing so hard he was wiping tears from his eyes, at the dog snoring softly at my feet. I smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached my eyes. "Not in the way that matters," I said, my voice clear and steady. I gestured with my glass towards the scattered, joyful group of people. "This is my family." Ms. Gable didn't press. She just nodded, a look of deep understanding on her face. "The best kind," she said softly. When the last guest had departed and the yard was quiet again, I stood alone on my porch, the string of fairy lights I'd hung casting a soft glow. The house behind me was no longer just a structure of wood and nails, it was a sanctuary. It was proof that you could tear down a life that was built for you and construct a new one of your own design. I hadn't heard from my parents or my brother. I didn't know if Adrian had married Isabel, or if the cracks in their perfect facade had shattered it completely. I found that I didn't need to know. Their story was no longer my story. My life was no longer a footnote. It was the whole book. And I was the one writing it. Standing there, in the warm, jasmine-scented air of my own small piece of the world, I felt a profound, quiet, and unshakable sense of peace. I was home.